Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor and privilege to speak today on Bill C-8 from the traditional unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw people. I want to acknowledge that the riding of Nanaimo-Ladysmith lies within the territories of the Snuneymuxw, Snunawis, Staminas, and Liaxin First Nations. Haichka Siem. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member from Sydney, Victoria for sharing this time with me today so I could speak to this important bill. Bill C-8 is an act to amend the Citizenship Act. The bill changes the oath of citizenship so that newcomers to Canada, in addition to pledging allegiance to the Queen, will also faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms the Aboriginal treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The Snuneymuxw people whose territory I'm speaking from today signed a treaty in 1854. This was the 14th of and the last of the so-called Douglas treaties, and it was ignored for over 100 years. It was not until the landmark White and Bob Supreme Court case in 1965 that this treaty was finally recognized by the Government of Canada. This historic case marked the beginning of the modern era of treaty and Aboriginal rights and title advocacy and activism across Canada. I learned about this treaty while working on a film about the Nanaimo River entitled Voices of the River. In my interviews with Snuneymuxw elder Ellen White and with her grandson Doug White, who was the chief of Snuneymuxw First Nation at the time, they both emphasized the importance of this treaty and the rights and title that it enshrines. Most residents of Nanaimo would have no knowledge of this treaty and what it means. It is a constant struggle for the Snuneymuxw people to have their treaty rights recognized. This is true for First Nations across Canada, as we have seen with the Mi'kmaq fishery in Nova Scotia and the Haudenosaunee dispute in Caledonia, Ontario. We are all treaty people in Canada. We have historic treaties that need to be respected, and for those First Nations that have never signed treaties, it is incumbent upon the government to go through the modern-day treaty process in a respectful way. It's important for newcomers to Canada to understand the Indigenous and First Nations rights enshrined in the Canadian Constitution and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. All Canadians, including new Canadians, need to understand these legal documents. They should understand that if they are not in a region that is covered by a treaty, then they are in a region that has never surrendered and is still legally Indigenous territory. This bill completes 94 of the 94 calls, number 94 of the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That doesn't mean that this Parliament has finally got to the end of the list and has implemented the previous 93 calls to action. Far from it. We have a very poor record of implementing these calls to action. Earlier this year, my colleague, the Honourable Member from Fredericton, presented a scorecard in her speech on this issue. Out of the 52 broader reconciliation recommendations, 7 have been completed. Under justice, 1 out of 18. Language and culture, 1 out of 5. Health, 0. Education, 0. Child welfare, 0. 5 recommendations were completed in the first year and just 4 since 2016. At the current rate, it will take approximately 38 more years before all of the calls to action are implemented. This is not reconciliation in action. This call to action number 94 is important, but there are far more urgent calls to action that we need to turn our attention to. Call to action number 1 calls upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit to reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care. Right now, there are more Indigenous children in the child welfare system in this country than there were children in the residential schools at the height of the residential school system. This is an ongoing abuse of human rights and a violation of fundamental social justice. When I talk to local leaders from First Nations and urban Indigenous communities in my riding, they tell me the same thing. Children are being apprehended by provincial child welfare agencies, not because the parents have neglected to provide their children with love, care, or attention. The majority of child welfare apprehensions are a direct result of poverty and inadequate housing. The Government of Canada could deal with this immediately with a poverty reduction strategy and a rapid housing program for First Nations and urban Indigenous populations. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry recommendations called for a guaranteed livable income to ensure that no Canadian needs to live in poverty. A guaranteed livable income would remove the bias inherent in our social welfare programs, and we would be a step towards ending systemic racism in this country. Indigenous people are overrepresented in our prison system and in our homeless population. This is also a direct result of poverty and the disproportionate number of children pulled from their families and communities by the child welfare system. We have a long way to go towards true reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada. Under the reconciliation section of the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, the first call to action, number 43, calls upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a framework for reconciliation. This is important. We need to get this done right away. Why are we not debating this right now? Madam Speaker, it is a national shame that Indigenous communities have boil water advisories that go on for years and even decades, that Indigenous communities deal with serious and persistent poverty, that Indigenous people are overrepresented in our criminal justice system and in our homeless population, that we have such high levels of suicide among Indigenous youth, and that health outcomes for Indigenous people are comparable to residents of low-income countries. It is an international black eye for Canadians that we have encroaching developments and industrial projects forced upon Indigenous communities after sham consultations, and then have those developments and projects rammed through with enforcement actions by highly armed, militarized police forces. We need economic reconciliation to improve the conditions for economic development and economic sovereignty for First Nations. The connection to land is key to the culture of Indigenous people in Canada, but as colonizers, we have broken that link. The reserve system forced Indigenous people off the land and took away those key connections to their culture. Industrialization has destroyed many traditional territories with resource extraction, including excessive logging, mining, and oil and gas production, destroying biodiversity and leaving behind toxic messes. In my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith, the traditional lands of the Hulkaminam-speaking people were stolen out from under them with the ENN land grant 150 years ago. Coal Baron and BC Cabinet Minister Robert Dunsmuir was given 8,000 square kilometers of land, 20% of Vancouver Island, to build the ENN Railway from Esquimalt to Nanaimo as part of the deal for BC to join Confederation. This corrupt deal and historic wrong needs to be corrected. We cannot celebrate 150 years of BC joining Confederation next year without reparation for this theft. Reconciliation must be more than words. It must include reparation for historic wrongs. There is a long list of things we need to do to make things right in our relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in this country. If this is indeed our most important relationship, as the Prime Minister has often repeated, then let's get on with it. I've had the honor and privilege of working with many newcomers to Canada, and I know they are keen to be good citizens and become part of our communities. Many of the newcomers arrive from difficult situations and have faced war, poverty, environmental degradation, and human rights abuses. Once they learn about our history and fully understand the circumstances that many Indigenous people live with in Canada, these newcomers are shocked. Bill C-8 is an acknowledgement of the responsibility of all Canadians, including new Canadians. It is an important piece of legislation. The Green Party supports this legislation. We support all the calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We support the recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, and we support the full implementation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. I hope to debate much more legislation implementing urgent calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Report soon. I hope this happens in the very near future. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for North Island-Paula River.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his question. You know, one of the biggest challenges that we face when we look at this piece of legislation is that we're still not seeing a government that's taking an active role in actually implementing the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation study. So here we are again, another small step, but we still don't see substantive support to move forward in a way that is really about reconciliation. So I'm wondering if the member through you, Madam Speaker, could talk about why Indigenous communities are being asked to wait government after government, and when we're going to actually see action, and what would that action look like? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Well, I'd like to thank the honourable member for her question. It is a very good question. I'd like to know myself, when is the government going to take the appropriate action? When are we going to move on the rest of these calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? When are we going to deal with the recommendations from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, including a guaranteed livable income? When are we going to move Indigenous people out of poverty and deal with our child welfare system? And I think that we need to do these things as soon as possible. And I would invite the honourable member to stand with me when I talk about reparation for the ENN land grant. I know that part of her riding is in that ENN land grant, and that is historic wrong and one of the most corrupt deals in this country that allowed the coal baron Robert Dunsmuir to build castles in Victoria based on the wealth that he extracted from First Nations territories.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Saint-Hubert. Madam Speaker, I agree. I'd like to thank my colleague for his very interesting speech. Yes, for several years, we've noticed the Liberal government not doing anything on the Indigenous files. We talked about there are reserves with no drinking water, but we need concrete action. But here, in this bill, it is concrete action. It is useful. It's important to put it in the Act. But while we're doing this, if we're going to add it, and when we say that the Constitution is going to recognize the treaties with Indigenous peoples, if we're amending the Citizenship Act, if we're going to delve into it and swear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, if we're going to be cleaning up the oath, which is important, we could also remove things that are not useful, such as that.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for his statement, and I'm sure that if the members of the Bloc Québécois have other ideas that they'd like to bring forward in changing the oath of citizenship, that they can do that in one of their opposition days. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And, 94 resolutions. Many of those resolutions are not actually federal jurisdictional changes that are required. I believe it's about 75 that are. Not all of the recommendations require legislation in order to be able to deal with the resolution. Let's take a look at the very first resolution dealing with child welfare. Would the member not agree that many of these resolutions and recommendations are in fact being acted on, at least in part, because you have to work with other stakeholders? That the federal government just can't sweep and say, okay, it's done. That there is an obligation to work with stakeholders. Would he not at least acknowledge that that is in fact the case for many of the resolutions?
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. And I do agree, we need to work as a country with different levels of government to deal with all of these calls to action. There are things that the federal government can do right away, and one of those things is to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that is something I would like to see this government push forward right away. Like, let's get that legislation dropped ASAP. I've heard it.
Resuming debate.